Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to one of the talks, the final talk of our winter or fall semester on concrete in the series that we call the Modern Concrete Skyscraper. And tonight we're going to go back a little bit in time and to the west coast of the US in order to explore the influence of regionalism in a region that we have yet to address. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, Tyler Sprague, I show you the series that began last summer, where we explored in particular the post-war developments of the influence of concrete applications in engineering and construction and skyscraper design, mostly in the US and especially in Chicago, but also, as you can see, in Italy, with the Pirelli Tower by Pierluigi Nervi. And we also looked to Australia, and then in our talk last month in November to Montreal and to Quebec, where Katie Phillips spoke about the Place Victoria, a building in which Nervi and the Italian architect Moretti were involved in advancing a modernist, a post-war modernism approach to engineering the tall building. But if we look back into the first part of the 20th century, the application of concrete as a structural system, not using or superseding or replacing steel is a rare thing in the US. But it turns out that Seattle explores a concrete frame in a number of works that have been the subject of research by our speaker, Tyler Sprague. He is a structural engineer and an art historian who teaches at the University of Washington. He is on the faculty there in the Department of Architecture, and he also has an adjunct appointment in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And he earned his degrees at the University of California, Berkeley, and as well as the University of Washington. And he worked professionally as a structural engineer. He then returned to school, completed his PhD on thin-shelled structures, and he has been publishing, in particular, in a book called Sculpture on a Grand Scale, The Shell Modernism of Jack Christensen, focusing with most of this research on the Pacific Northwest. And it's I guess, a tactic or a strategy of looking at the across the kind of spectrum of material manufacture, engineering, design, and production and buildings in the context of the Pacific Northwest that he's going to talk about tonight, integrating all of those environmental and material forces in their expression in tall buildings in the urban scene of a growing city in the early 20th century, that is the city of Seattle. So let me invite Tyler to come onto the screen. And after Tyler gives his presentation, I'll come back onto the screen. We'll have a bit of a conversation, but we hope that we'll be able to integrate some of your own questions into that discussion. So Tyler, as I turn my camera off, please take it away. I'm really looking forward to this view.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm excited to speak with you today. My name is Tyler Sprague. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Architecture. And as Carol said, I am a structural engineer and a historian. And I really blend those two things together as I start looking at different aspects of history of the built environment. So today I'm going to be talking about unique developments in concrete skyscrapers in Seattle in the 1920s. During this pre-Depression time, concrete construction really boomed in Seattle, completely reshaping the downtown core and pushing the material to new heights. As the city grew, concrete emerged as the preferred building material at this time, certainly over steel. And so as we'll see in this talk, this was due to several different factors all coming together at once: material availability, technical expertise, building code allowance, and most importantly, ambitious and creative architects and engineers eager to make the most of this emerging material. Now I want to start with a little word of warning. There will be some claims in this presentation of things being the most something in the world. The tallest thing, the biggest thing, the largest thing, as recalled from historical references. As always, these are taken with a grain of salt, ripe to be contradicted at any time. Some remain true, some are not true. And I certainly welcome comments to the contrary. But taken slightly differently, these claims do indicate a great sense of pride, of achievement, and of place. They show a boldness, a growing confidence in the use of concrete, and its effectiveness in building a city. For example, in the course of this research, I uncovered this article from the 1927 Seattle Times discussing the production of reinforcing steel in Seattle, a necessary part of concrete construction. Embedded in the article, we have this statement: reinforced concrete has reached the highest point of development in Seattle. This is acknowledged by builders and engineers of the nation. One reason for this, largely due to the fact that this state has the finest cement to be found in the world, and it's manufactured. The finest, most desirable grades of sand for concrete work abound. Pure, clean water is plentiful, and the right kind of gravel so necessary for proper concrete mixing to be had. Further down it states, but this high grade of man-made stone requires steel reinforcement when poured into skyscrapers. And this building material is being made in Seattle. Today, reinforced concrete buildings and bridges are strictly Seattle and Washington products. Cement, sand, gravels, and steel are all products of the state. So there's much to uncover in these types of statements. And again, this is in the Seattle Daily Times. So this is the popular newspaper of the time, right? Lots to unpack here. So just a quick reminder of where Seattle is, a little simple map there, because geography is very important when discussing anything with Seattle history. The location has impacted much of its development, as we are far from the urban centers of the East. Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, even San Francisco and Los Angeles on the West Coast are not really nearby. So outside technologies tended to take a while to arrive in Seattle, and by the time they did, locals had often developed their own techniques anyway. While Seattle has become increasingly connected, this geography is still important. And once we zoom in, we see that the city looks something like this: a 2014 view of downtown, surrounded by mountains and waterways. Deep glacial carvings create networks of deep lakes and sounds. It is not a place of easy urban expansion. So construction is often concentrated in specific areas, providing a need for density and height. And so if we step back in time and start our historical conversation, we're going to do that with another bird's eye view of Seattle here in 1889. This was sketched just before the Great Seattle Fire. Seattle, of course, exists on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, who were largely displaced by the Western developments we will discuss today, though they remain an active part of its future. Even the name of the city itself, shared with the influential Duwamish leader, Chief Seattle, is a reminder of this past. But in 1899, this is a port city, a city of light-framed wood buildings, and a few remaining log cabins. Like many cities, the urban fire served as a point of transition from a light-framed city of wood to one of stone, steel, and eventually concrete. So here we see a postcard from 1906. This is a rebuilding city, largely of heavy timber and stone masonry wall construction, considered to be fireproof, preventing any sort of future fires from taking place. These are mid-rise buildings and continue to dominate downtown. In Seattle, it's the era of timber and fish and trade that are driving the city's economy. Okay? So this low-rise city certainly does get transformed significantly, though, in 1914. So it's around this time when the first true skyscraper, steel-framed skyscraper, comes to Seattle, the Smith Tower. It is named after L.C. Smith, proprietor of the company that made Smith Corona typewriters and Smith & Wesson revolvers. The company was speculating on Seattle's growth and wanted to anchor themselves in the frontier city. However, designed by the Syracuse, New York firm of Gagin and Gagin and built by the New York-based Whitney Company, the Smith Tower is almost entirely a product of the East. And it was advertised at the time as the tallest building outside of New York City, but it's really a little bit of New York City brought to Seattle. It has a form that recalls the Cass-Gilbert Woolworth building with a setback tower on top of a larger base, like the skyscrapers of New York. This design was intended to prevent the canyoning of streets as buildings grew taller, even though this really wasn't an issue in Seattle at the time. Smith Tower is a rigid steel frame. The entire steel frame for the building was shipped to Seattle by rail from the east. Almost all the building material was brought from somewhere else. Without the iron deposits or major steel investors of the East, local steel was simply too expensive to produce a building at this scale. And while certainly a landmark and a beautiful building in its own right, Smith Tower was not really a model for other buildings to follow in Seattle. Right? Other national trends would have an influence. And we really find that in this landmark building. So the landmark 1902 Ingalls building in Cincinnati, widely recognized as the first reinforced concrete skyscraper. This building was publicized in Seattle quite widely with its own article in the Seattle Times. Seattle Times is quoted as saying, "In fact, it is a concrete box of 8-inch walls with concrete floors and roof, concrete beams, concrete columns, concrete stairs. The whole entirely devoid of the usual I-beams, Z-bars, angle iron, plates, rivets, and bolts. It consists merely of bars embedded in concrete with the ends interlaced, being actually a complete concrete monolith of the entire building." You can almost hear the amazement in the text that the whole building was made of cast concrete. We get a little indication of the reinforcing steel shown here as it uses the ransom method, where twisted square bars are arranged top and bottom, quite a departure from the proprietary reinforcing systems used in the earlier concrete warehouse. So we do concrete warehouses of people like Albert Kahn through the Truss-Kahn system. So this really is a departure and a significant building as it indicates a skyscraper future to come. And there was interest in Seattle in making the most of this new type of building material. In 1906, Seattle Times described needed changes to the building code, claiming there at the bottom that arrangements were being made by the fire marshal and building inspector to draft new building ordinances and place Seattle among cities where the best in building science is required. Highlighted there, we see an important quote. "Reinforced concrete is taking the place of steel, just as steel took the place of wood. Permanence and strength, as well as an insurance against danger from fires, has become the necessary." So there's an early interest in not only designing in concrete, but seeing it as an advancement of the field. But height restrictions on concrete remained in the Seattle Building Code, explicitly limiting concrete to 10 stories. Architects and engineers began to push for lifting this restriction, calling it arbitrary and foolish. Here we see the architect A.W. Gould, who had experience from the Midwest before coming out to Seattle, who was pushing hard for these code changes to unlock concrete construction in Seattle. Despite this claims of being foolish, these height restrictions remained on the books for many years. Building officials did not trust the material technology to go tall. So architects like Gould continued to design concrete buildings, but were limited to ones 9 stories tall, like the Arctic building that we see right there. Something else starts to happen significant north of the city, however. A local production of cement was just beginning. The Pacific Northwest has large glacial deposits of clay, limestone, and dense aggregate, the essential ingredients in a modern cement, a Portland cement. And a quick note, Portland cement is the term used for what we consider modern cement, distinguishing it from compositions of lime-based or Roman cements or mortars that might be used to hold bricks together. And yes, Portland, Oregon is a town just down the coast from us, but they are of no relation in this discussion. So we'll continue to refer to Portland cement as the modern cement production that's taking place. So with a growing national interest in concrete, Cement City was founded in the North Cascades in roughly 1907. 100 miles from downtown Seattle, there was the beginnings of a easily accessible cement, and it started production in 1908. With the founding of the Superior Portland Cement plant. Superior Portland Cement invested heavily in state-of-the-art cement production equipment. The photo on the left shows a horizontal sloping rotary cement kiln. So this kiln is kind of important as it was a relatively new mechanism for heating, activating the raw materials in cement. So the crushed limestone and clay is heated, which is basically what activates the binding properties within it, gradually taking material from one end to the other, heating it along the way, along that long sort of pipe that's sloping down there in the middle. This was important because it greatly improved the quality and consistency of the cement through the constant rotation while it was heating, and an improvement over stationary kilns. So this meant that the Northwest not only had a local supply of cement, but it was reliable and of increasingly high quality. Other cement companies would soon form across the state, drastically increasing the production capacity and lowering the cost. And just as a note, Concrete Washington still exists in the North Cascades. Cement City merged with a nearby town of Baker to make the town of Concrete. The town is still there, and the silos are still there overlooking a city park as a reminder of this earlier heritage. So with this production in place, these firms not only are producing cement, but actively interested in changing minds about what concrete can do. So it's in 1914 that we see the three main producers of cement in the nation or in the state band together to basically ensure the quality assurance of their product. They employ a firm of Reitz, Story, and Duffy, Seattle-based engineers educated in the Northwest to ensure and reassure the public that high-rise concrete construction could be safe. So this is a quality assurance agreement between these providers that this outside firm would inspect and control basically the quality of products that are starting to be produced. And this is really what it takes, right? This is sort of the final piece of the puzzle. In 1921, we finally get the Seattle building officials to change their mind and open the floodgates for reinforced concrete construction. So in 1921, anxious to increase building in the city, we get an emergency ordinance passed, which releases which removes the 10-foot story or 10-story height limitation on reinforced concrete buildings. It does something else that maybe is also more significant, is it actually establishes some pretty cutting-edge ways of thinking about concrete in the code. These are summarized later, and apologies for getting a little bit technical here, but also important. So what that code change is established two classes of concrete construction. The traditional method, where the builder makes all the decisions and controls the quality, and a second class with a highly controlled water to cement ratio and inspection method, right? So when you're building a building, you get to decide if you want to do it the normal way or the highly inspected way. And the benefit is you get to increase your working stresses by approximately 25%. So this means it's an increase in the usable capacity of the material while ensuring still a high level of safety. So Engineering News Record, this is a national publication. We see the author here is Homer Hadley, who is the regional structural engineer for the Portland Cement Association. And he claims here, Seattle, Washington was the first city to adopt two classes of concrete passed essentially on control and supervision. The 1921 revision of its code required the presence of a highly qualified concrete supervisor on all work employing the higher stresses. So how would this work? Well, essentially, a supervisor and inspector must be selected from a list by the architect. This inspector would be paid by the owner, and the reports would go to the builder or the contractor, which is a pretty advanced sort of means of negotiating the different interests that exist on the job site. The owner has to pay, but as a result of the higher working stresses is effectively buying less concrete. The architect selects the inspector, but the reports go to the builder. So we see a publishing of these working stresses. So these numbers are in pounds per square inch. We have the two classes of concrete construction, and we can see that the ones on the right are roughly 20 to 25% higher. So really what this means when you all get down to it is you don't have to use as much concrete. You can buy less concrete and still make a building, as your elements are largely smaller because you're designing to these higher stresses here. And this is cutting edge stuff, right? This is the beginning of a national conversation on concrete design. It's becoming less of every engineer and building official doing it themselves and more of developing a shared knowledge base about how to design a high performance concrete. So this is pretty cutting edge stuff at the time. Homer Hadley himself is a fascinating national figure in the development of concrete at the time, here described as one of the ace men of the Pacific Northwest. During World War I, Hadley dabbled in concrete ships, worked on roadways in the Northwest, later as a representative of the Portland Cement Association. His innovative designs really disseminated across the Northwest. And so finally, we start seeing the concrete buildings that you've been promised. So the code changes really do work. Within a few years, Seattle is in the midst of a building boom, largely fueled by concrete construction. 10 to 15-story buildings in concrete become common in the downtown core as department stores and company offices expanded quickly. In 1924, we see the Dexter Horton building built, designed by the architect John Graham, rising to 15 stories, well past that 10-story height limit. The building has a continuous base, but rises into 4 separated sections, joined by a common hallway down the back. In plan, we can see the massive footprint, the deep light courts, giving the building effectively the plan of a 4-legged letter E, right? The separation was allowed to natural light and air to flow otherwise through a massive building block. Concrete columns are shown spaced along the exterior perimeter and down the center of each floor plate. Here we can see it under construction as a massive concrete frame with concrete columns, beams, and slab. In this photo, we see 2 of the legs of the E already up and clad, sort of in the distance. The next 2 are coming up. While the process of construction are certainly beyond the scope of the talk today, there are certainly interesting discussions about innovations in formwork, cranes, pumps, and etc. And in contrast to the Smith Tower, the Dexter Horton building is really a product of the Northwest. In the Seattle Times, there's a pride that one of the city's largest buildings, by probably floor area, was designed and produced and built by the people of the Northwest. We have the Superior Cement Company. We have local terracotta and brick used as cladding. The architect, John Graham, has had a Seattle practice for many years, a much more local building of reinforced concrete. And here's just an image of the building today, still an active part of the downtown core. And the concrete buildings keep coming. In the northern part of downtown, we see the construction of a medical dental building by John Kreutzer and A.H. Albertson. The building housed medical offices and a growing physician community in Seattle. It's getting up to 18 stories now, measuring 252 feet tall. In the drawings, we can see how it steps back at the top to accentuate the height. There's also this continuous base, which was built in anticipation of a future expansion, which would come some years later. It's sort of an Art Deco detailing here with a little bit of neo-Gothic finishes as it comes through. In plan, we can see how the building actually wraps a corner with a regular spacing of concrete columns along the perimeter and on the interior, right? It's a little difficult to see, but this building actually has hexagonal concrete columns, which is a little bit of a deviation from the norm, but an interesting indication of some of the experimentation that was coming on at the time. And its structural engineer, R.R. Montel, certainly was interested in promoting the building as one of the nation's tallest. We can see here in the Seattle Times again, in his own advertisements, claiming it to be the third tallest building in the world using exclusively reinforced concrete construction. And not only making these claims, Montel did a little bit of research. He did actually ask around about what the other tall concrete buildings were of the time. And, this is what he's coming up with. So he mentions these in his article. We have the Medical Arts Building in Dallas. Interestingly, another sort of medical facility coming up, built in 1923, 18 floors, same number of floors, and slightly higher at 281 feet. He mentions the United Brethren Building in Dayton, which is actually, there was an earlier building that had capped out, and just in 1924 did they add the 7-story extension on top to pop it up to that 276 feet. So the one in Seattle is shorter than those two on the left, and yet taller from the one on the right, the Hyde and Leather Building in New York, also at 18 floors, but at 222 feet. Right. So this is the conversation that Seattle engineers are having with others that are building in concrete around the nation. Montel is, of course, ignoring the 1911 Royal Liver Building built in Liverpool, England, which was 13 floors, but up to 322 feet. So perhaps his claim of being third tallest in the world might need to be revised. Still undeterred, Montel in the article states, the future, no doubt, will find reinforced concrete construction developed to its highest point and used most extensively by Pacific Coast engineers. Still interested in that. Okay, so as I mentioned, the effects of that code change on development in Seattle are pretty profound. Seattle is in a building boom by 1928. And downtown buildings are going up at an incredible rate. In this full-page article from the Seattle Times, over 75% of the buildings shown have a reinforced concrete frame. From the department stores to the Olympic Hotel, the Northern Life Tower in the upper right of that article is actually a hybrid of concrete and steel to reaching another skyscraper-like height. And the cement plant, Superior Portland Cement Company, has an advertisement here seen congratulating the open of a significant department store downtown, the Bon Marché. It's pretty clear that concrete is the material of Seattle at the moment, and this boom is largely fueled by concrete buildings. And we keep getting taller. So in 1929, just a year later, the Exchange Building by John Graham, the architect of the previous Dexter Horton Building, pushes the height up to 23 stories. 23 stories. In the promotional material, the building was described as having 378,000 square feet of floor area and rising to a height of 277 feet, 3.5 inches to the top of the highest parapet. So we have a careful measurement happening there. The phrase, however, that they use to advertise the building, I think needs a little bit of work. A building built where a building was needed. Maybe could I come up with something a little different there to promote the building? As it was pretty interesting of what the building was for. So the Exchange Building was designed to house the Seattle Stock Exchange, a short-lived regional exchange where shares of banks, public and private utilities, agriculture producers, the Boeing Aircraft Company, and others were exchanged. So this exchange operated from 1927 to 1942. The lower levels included a trading floor. The upper levels included offices. We can see in plan we have this curved elevator bank, which would made for a dramatic exit onto each of the floors and the offices, right? The publicity materials stated a vast amount of thought and study by owners and the architect has been devoted to the objective of creating a masterpiece in office building design. It has been the aim to embody in it all the desirable up-to-date features and developments, and of course that means reinforced concrete. The details of these types of buildings are just really quite exquisite and fun to look at. We see this Art Deco detailing down at the base of the terracotta and brick exterior. And interestingly, we actually see that the John Graham Company included both architects and engineers in its office. So that means we get some semblance of the structural design of this building, which is really interesting for a guy like me. We can see here a whole building section. And if we zoom in, we can see a slice through the beams and the flat slabs that are making up the stacked floors of the structure going up. The general notes are shown as well, revealing the reinforcing details and some of the methods of construction. We can see in the upper left that they specify the supervised construction concrete in reference to that Seattle code where they're able to use the higher stresses in their design. They also describe the method of reinforcing, following roughly the Ransom method with top and bottom bars. We have these stirrups that are used to resist shear and some of these different bent bar types that are called out at different places in the building. There's also a reference to hard grade deformed bars, which means we are no longer twisting bars that are embedded in the concrete. The bars now have protruding lugs or bumps of a different pattern along their length to increase the bond between the concrete and the steel, which is of course necessary for it to work all as one. And this precedes any sort of standardization of these deformed barred lugs. And I would love to get a little more information about what those bars look like, but we haven't quite uncovered that just quite yet. We can see a structural detail of the building as well, where we see columns called out in specific locations, beams going in between the columns, and then a beam schedule describing how big each beam is in each location, the width, the depth, and the type of reinforcing that goes into there. So an incredibly modern in terms of current way of redesigning buildings. There's an organization and a thought that pretty closely matches contemporary methods in these drawings. Now, this particular method, I will also say, is somewhat distinct of the Northwest as well, right? We see another article slightly later in the 1930s, written by two engineers here in the Northwest, describing this flat slab and beam design. Seems to be characteristic of concrete buildings in the Northwest. These engineers argue for integrating architecture, structure, finish, and mechanical design in this simple arrangement of structure, simply a deep beam in one direction and a slab in the other one. So the formability of concrete is incredibly valuable, allowing for a reduction in story height. So actually the floor to floor height can be reduced if you streamline the structure in between them. They publish a list of concrete buildings, their heights, their years, and the proportions of their structure, as though trying to prove to the nation about the efficiency of their design and the characteristics of design in the Northwest and how they are making the most out of their concrete, designing it as a high performance material in efficient yet simple ways. Right? So there's clearly a culture of concrete construction and design that's developing here in the Northwest. There's a shared knowledge base that's creating a large number of buildings and of course going to these new heights. Right? So always anxious for some national credibility, the Seattle Times exclaimed the Exchange Building was the second largest of its type, second in size to only one building, and that being in New York. Among American structures, 23 stories, 278 feet, more than 5 acres of office space. So this, of course, begs the question, which is this other New York building to which it is comparing itself, right? And as far as I can tell, it's this building, the Master Printers building in New York, recently completed a year or so before, with exactly the same height, 278 feet. Although for a significantly different use as sort of a light industrial. So while the Exchange Building has 28 floors of space, this Master Printers building has only 18 floors with much more spaced out floors and probably larger floor-to-floor heights in there. So here is the Exchange Building as it exists, still downtown, still a landmark, still a gorgeously detailed building, and highly celebratory of its reinforced concrete frame. And in 1930, we see the Seattle municipal government, or the Seattle City Light, the publicly held electrical utility, has a need for a building. And so they decide to go for a tall concrete one themselves. This electric utility was one of the first publicly owned utilities in the nation, relying on hydroelectric dams that were being built also of concrete in the North Cascades. So the same region where we have concrete Washington, just further up the river, we've got a series of hydroelectric dams that are providing inexpensive, publicly owned power to the city of Seattle. Right? The architect Earl Morrison worked with the engineers Harold Worthington and George Runciman, who were the authors of that ENR article, to design this building. It's interesting to note that those engineers, Worthington and Runciman, were working for a company known as the W.H. Witt Company, which was a structural engineering firm that was the predecessor to Worthington Skilling, and then ultimately Skilling, Hele, Christensen, Robertson, the Seattle structural engineering firm that worked with Minoru Yamasaki on the World Trade Center towers much later. So there certainly was a long legacy of design excellence in tall buildings in that structural engineering firm. So we see the proposal for the Seattle City Light Tower here. On the narrow dimension, it really starts to take the shape of a skyscraper, stepping back and stepping up, clearly emphasizing its height with the architectural feature going up to that tower at the same time. Right? In plan, we see these massive columns, likely 30 inches by 30 inches, that were extending in the center of the plan there, that would have gone up, continued up all the way up the tower. With Runciman and Worthington as engineers, it's likely that it was a one-way slab system like the one they had written about, designed with the supervised concrete working stresses allowed under the Seattle Code. And in the base here, again, we see the Art Deco detailing, highly, being very clear about the offices that were within for the Seattle City Light. It was an interesting arrangement for how the city was actually going to build the building, as they weren't necessarily going to do the development themselves. To finance the tower, it was to be a privately held company that owned the building. The ground was to be leased from the city for 50 years rent-free, and the City Light offices agreed to a 20-year rental of the office space within. So we see the emergence of a development company specifically there to finance the building, the construction of the building. And we see the advertisements here where they're clearly using reinforced concrete as a metaphor for stability and strength, and as the grounding for a good investment promising strong returns. And we see here on one of the ads highlighted on the right, another claim, this time as the building as being the tallest all reinforced concrete building in the world, right? So it's quite a transition of sort of thinking about concrete and its role in tall buildings to see it celebrated here in that manner, right? So was it actually going to be the tallest concrete building in the world? We see its publicized height at 367 feet. However, we see another building that was likely completed just a year earlier, the Century Tower in Chicago, topping out at 395 feet, so exceeding that height limit. But I guess this was not known to those who were publishing those ads and trying to attract investors, right? So there's clearly some civic competition here on height, but Seattle is right in the mix with these other major cities in terms of pushing the limits of how tall you can go with reinforced concrete. So here's another ad that they are using to sell bonds, which is, I think, particularly interesting, because we see the diagrammatically shown the concrete foundations being poured with the reinforcing steel sticking out of the base, with the investors looking down, where concrete is highlighted as the foundation of a good investment. It's the symbol of solidity and permanence. Any of the nervousness in the 1910s surrounding concrete construction was clearly gone. Here, concrete was meant to reinsure investors that their money was safe. So this is 1931. However, the effects of the Great Depression were sweeping the nation, and while they were a bit slow to arrive in Seattle, they certainly did. So in 1933, all that had been built for the Seattle City Light Tower were the foundations and the lower story. But those foundations are there, and the large concrete columns are there. Just a few years later, we see just 2 stories have been added, and these are indeed the offices for the Seattle City Light, right? And it sort of stayed this way for quite some time. It wasn't until 1957 when a new era of skyscrapers in downtown Seattle begins to take over, where the base is topped by a steel and glass post-war skyscraper with cladding that came down over the Art Deco detailing. And this building still exists today as a sleek glass and steel skyscraper. So a symbolic reference to how this early Art Deco era of reinforced concrete skyscrapers has come to an end. That Art Deco detailing is likely still there, but concealed and wrapped in an entirely different aesthetic. So while this era of early concrete skyscrapers in Seattle was over, certainly taken down by the Great Depression and the resulting wartime years, this concrete knowledge base, this culture of concrete construction persisted. During the Depression, the same engineers that were designing these reinforced concrete skyscrapers developed cutting-edge bridge designs that once again led the nation through their innovation and simplicity. The rise of individual automobiles created demands for new roadways. So we see concrete box girders of record spans, and we see the floating concrete pontoon bridge, which crossed Lake Washington as one of the only concrete pontoon bridges in the world, now appropriately named the Homer Hadley Bridge. So this really does bookend our talk here today. Many of the buildings that were shown still stand, shaping downtown Seattle, artifacts of this unique time. This convergence of factors leading to this growth, the technical expertise, the material availability, the allowance in the code, and these creative architects and engineers really created this era, this distinct and contained era in reinforced concrete skyscrapers in Seattle. And I think I'll leave it there. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. Such fascinating material. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. I must say I knew absolutely nothing of this history. And so it's really something that we are going to factor into the exhibition, at least on our timeline wall, where there is a notable absence of reinforced concrete in high rises from the first half of the 20th century, from the kind of one-off projects like the Ingalls building, which really had no successors in in Cincinnati, and the medical arts buildings that you mentioned that kind of would pop up in the smaller cities across the U.S. But they're not notable as an expression of concrete. They look just like they would be steel buildings. So I wonder if I could start by asking you, and I'm encouraging other people to add their questions into the chat if they're so inspired. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the architectural and engineering culture in Chicago, the professional culture in Seattle, and also your own university. Did it figure into that the kind of shared discussion about materials or style, or what formed these ideas that seem to be prevailing in the 1920s in Seattle, certainly recognizable, if not distinguishable that much from New York or Chicago in the same period.
Yeah, well, Seattle has always been a bit of a pioneer city. No one really accidentally finds themselves here. It takes a certain spirit of a person to venture out west. But the university is certainly a hub of architects being educated and engineers being educated as well. There's sort of a practicality to the architecture here in these early years, certainly influenced by design trends in the East, but there's a focus on self-reliance and sort of a pioneer determination that you really see come through. People are anxious to try new things here, often unencumbered by traditions that they might find somewhere else. There's a freedom of experimentation. So certainly the Department of Architecture had a strong program, and several of the architects came from there. The Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering was very early in the research into reinforced concrete. So there is mention that the Seattle engineering community is on board with reinforced concrete from the beginning. And the specifics of that are part of the ongoing research that I'm doing, exactly who was working on that. But Homer Hadley is certainly a central figure in that conversation. He did work for an architect early on. So he worked in the offices of an architect before working for the Portland Cement Association. So he had a certain freedom in that role to not necessarily be constrained to a specific project or market. He had a freedom to innovate and to push these new ideas. So he's the name that you see on a lot of publications. You see him referenced as a design consultant, and he's really one of the people that's at the forefront of this innovation.
Mm-hmm. And what about stylistic influences? Where were they looking? What were the inspiration, or what were they copying? How confident were they in innovating? One thinks of kind of the Louis Sullivan narrative about a master or a renegade, or a unique expressive voice.
Yeah, well, I think they're definitely looking to Chicago and the Midwest as well as New York. Those are sort of the centers of tall building design. So John Graham himself actually was British. He was born in Liverpool before coming out to the Northwest. So there's architects that are looking other places in the country. But it's tough to pin down a singular sort of influence for all the architects in the region. We certainly have a good collection of Art Deco buildings. We have some certainly neo-Gothic buildings on our University of Washington campus. So they appear tapped in, but it's difficult to say if they had a specific influence or a specific place where they were all looking. Certainly aware of the national conversation and wanting to make a name for Seattle. That does come through in their publications.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. You left out the period of the Depression, 1930s, between the stock market crash and the kind of collapse of the economy that put certainly a moment, a caesura in the development boom that clearly was being expressed in the
Hmm.
Seattle economy. But I know that we earlier talked about hotel architecture that what
Hmm.
one might call in concrete, that one might call a kind of depression modern or modern
Sure.
style. Before this engineering aesthetic of the bridges and the kind of connection to a European ideology
Hmm.
of design that certainly takes over in education as well in schools of
Right.
architecture in the post-war period.
Yep, there's sort of a next wave of a streamlined modern, or a sort of a more sort of what we think of as modernism sort of taking hold. So there starts to become a slip form concrete building where we start to see the true expression of concrete on the exterior, which is pretty significant. Where we're no longer relying on brick and terracotta. We're now looking to concrete to become that expressive medium. So we see some experimentation with that during those Depression years. Bridges at the same time do get celebrated for their aesthetic quality. We have emergence of international figures like Robert Maillart, where their bridges are seen as beautiful, and that's part of the concrete aesthetic that continues to develop during those Depression years. And, eventually the curriculum here in the Department of Architecture also begins to become more modern, stepping away from the education of the École des Beaux-Arts, where there's the emphasis on drawing and sort of cladding and aesthetic. And that's where we start to see more of a modernistic sort of approach to concrete emerge. Yeah. So multiple chapters to the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you did talk very much about construction companies, whether there were builders who specialized in concrete and how that meshed with the other industry developments and the research in materials.
Yeah, there seemed to be several builders that were building in reinforced concrete. And in Seattle, we do see a separation of trades. So architects typically had their own offices. The John Graham Company was sort of unique in that they had architects and engineers in the same office. But the W.H. Witt Company was a standalone consulting structural engineering firm that worked with many different architects. And then there were similarly several different builders who were developing their techniques for concrete construction. So you see several different builders on different projects, all reaching heights. And again, yep, it'll take a little more research to figure out how they were developed, or their techniques that were used. But there was certainly a culture and a community of building in concrete that was developing at the time. So not a single firm, but multiple firms.
And was there any competition from steel during these years?
So there were some steel buildings that were coming up. Yep, we do have some steel framed high rises, and they certainly had the cachet of being the super tall ones. So we finished at about 23, 28 stories. The Smith Tower was built at 42 stories. So in terms of actual height, there is a big difference between a reinforced concrete skyscraper and a steel skyscraper at the time. So there are several steel frame buildings. They were typically more expensive. And the discussion of one versus the other, often it was outside investors or someone who was more comfortable with a steel building, willing to pay a bit of a premium for that steel here in Seattle. Yeah, but there are quite a few steel framed ones in downtown Seattle as well. Yeah.
Well, speaking of investors, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what seemed to be the speculative nature of in the 1920s boom, and who was it who was investing in these buildings?
Um, so it was often industrialists, so large bankers that wanted to open office space for their own companies, either trading companies or, like we saw, the exchange. So they would want an office for themselves and then build multiple floors, sort of thinking that there were more clients to come. So Dexter Horton was a significant business person in the city, and that was his building that was built. It's pretty unique, the Seattle City Light financing. They actually went for sort of the crowdsourcing approach, trying to look for individual investors through the newspaper. So that was pretty unique at the time. So I think it varied from project to project. I'm fascinated by the early Seattle Stock Exchange and everything that was going on in there as a regional exchange. So there was certainly a collection of businesses that were interested in bringing that to Seattle, and they were the ones who funded that construction. Yeah. So it seems like the 20s certainly was a time where money was available, and they were interested in building a building as a symbol of achievement and projecting into the future. Yeah.
And the growth of the population during those years, was it substantial? Was it through immigration?
Yep.
Where did people come from?
Largely through immigration. So from the sort of fire into the 1910s and 1920s, a lot of people were attracted to Seattle. There was a World's Fair in Seattle that created the University of Washington campus in 1909, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. So discovery of gold up in Alaska. Seattle sort of became this gateway to Alaska. So for a lot of people coming in and passing through, Seattle was the place they would come before they went to Alaska. So we see emergence of a lot of outdoor outfitters, trading companies, suppliers, merchants, bankers, the explosion of all of that in Seattle during that time.
Fascinating. Well, while we don't have any questions from the audience, we do have compliments for you. So I won't read it specifically, but a lot of appreciation for this, for a great lecture, and people who are traveling in the area too and feel really enriched by having this additional information. So we're drawing to the end of our hour, so I'll just reiterate that this is all very new material, at least to me, and the fact that it's concrete rather than just urban development in the Art Deco style gives a whole new dimension to thinking about these buildings. And as you have done, placing them in the context of the industry and the region and the engineering knowledge that was driving many of these motives and opportunities is really the kind of integrative history that we really need to have in order to explain why things are happening in certain places, rather than just seeing them as architects' influences traveling from one city to another. Cities have their own generative businesses and industries and environments and place, as you've described, and the point that you mentioned in the emphasis of the title of your work, really the sense of place and the connection to place in terms of the material, the regional, the environmental resources that are available. So I thank you very much for bringing all of this to our attention, and people will be able to look at it on our website and on our YouTube channel and absorb this again, as I certainly will, in order to make sure that I was able to really kind of take in all the material that you threw at us tonight in terms of a very energetic and rich lecture. So thanks so much for being with us.
I certainly appreciate the opportunity. It's been delightful to share it with you and the group.
Well, you've certainly extended our reach, and we thank you on the West Coast in your afternoon and our evening. And I invite everybody to watch on our website for the new additions to this series. But this concludes the end of the 2024 series, and on to the next quarter century, where we'll be looking at all historical periods of the modern concrete skyscrapers. So bye, everybody, and thank you again, Tyler, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.